Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council. My name is Barry Pavel. I'm a Senior Vice President and Director of the Scopecraft Center for Strategy and Security here. We gather at a really historic moment as the Biden administration prepares to host a Summit for Democracy, which will take place later this week on December 9th and 10th. The Summit for Democracy could not come at a more important time, as autocrats around the world brazenly seek to undermine democratic values and the rules-based order that has benefited so many for so long. Democracies must find new ways to work together to defend this order and uphold shared interests and values. I'm really delighted to be joined this morning by former NATO Secretary General Anders Fogg Rasmussen and also former Danish Prime Minister. He's also the founder of the Copenhagen-based Alliance of Democracies Foundation, which has been long advocating for a new Alliance of Democracies and with whom we are pleased to partner for today's event. I'm also thrilled to see my friend and former colleague Damon return to the Atlantic Council since he assumed his exciting new role as President of the National Endowment for Democracy. I look forward to hearing both from Anders and Damon. At the Atlantic Council, we are absolutely committed to providing policymakers, leaders, and the public with a platform to exchange ideas and develop actionable strategies in response to the many ongoing changes in the global system. The Scopecraft Center for Strategy and Security works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important challenges facing the United States and the world. The center honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. leadership in very close cooperation with allies and partners, and dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. We are very happy to collaborate on this event with our Atlantic Council colleagues from the Digital Forensics Research Lab and the 360 Stratcom Forum they are hosting all this week. Please do tune in to those events. Today's event and our report launch is part of the Scopecraft Center's broader stream of democratic order work led by Ash Jain, which is aimed at strengthening collaboration among democratic allies to combat authoritarian threats. It caps a series of pre-summit workshops that the Atlantic Council has organized in the past months to explore ways to maximize the outcomes of the Summit for Democracy. The report we are launching today, An Alliance of Democracies, From Concept to Reality in an Era of Strategic Competition, is part of a series of Atlantic Council publications calling for the United States and its allies to adapt and revitalize a rules-based international system and establish new institutions for this new era to strengthen cooperation among democracies. The report makes a very compelling case for an alliance and sets forth practical options to move this concept forward. So this is about action and not just a report. After Anders and Damon speak, we'll return to a robust panel discussion about the specific ideas that the report raises. And that discussion will be moderated by Ryan Heath. He is senior editor and author of the Global Insider newsletter at Politico. We'll also hear statements from two influential legislators on the idea of an alliance for democracies. First, the deputy chair of the Free Democratic Party in the German Bundestag, Johannes Fogel, and chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the UK House of Commons, Tom Tugendhat. As the summit convenes later this week, I'm also pleased to announce the launch of another exciting project aimed at promoting democracy in practical ways, and that's called the Fourth Democratic Wave Project, a joint effort between the Atlantic Council and the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and with the support of Peter Ackerman, who is head of ICNC and a longtime Atlantic Council board director. This project is aimed at catalyzing support for nonviolent pro-democracy movements and constraining authoritarian regimes. It will result in a three-part playbook for policymakers in the U.S. and leading democracies to help galvanize a fourth democratic wave. Again, welcome, and I'd like to now turn to Anders Fogg Rasmussen from the Alliance of Democracies Foundation for his remarks. Sir, thank you for joining us very much.
Thank you very much, Barry Powell. I'm equally excited about doing this project together the Atlantic Council, and the Alliance of Democracies Foundation. Our joint topic and our joint mission is an alliance of democracies. That's why my foundation bears that name. Our activities in the foundation are geared to laying the groundwork for such an alliance. I'm delighted to see President Biden convene the world's democracies this week, although virtually. In 2018, Joe Biden spoke at our inaugural Copenhagen Democracy Summit. He gave a powerful statement on behalf of the free world. Later, Biden added the suggestion of a summit of democracy to his electoral agenda. Now it is becoming reality. We can only cheer that on. The democratic world needs a reboot. But a summit is not enough. We need the world's democratic forces and countries to agree on concrete actions. The opposite side, the authoritarian club, is full of action, from China's flagrant disrespect for international rules of trade, with sanctions on Australia or Lithuania, to Putin's playing with the gas valve, pressuring European democracies, or to Lukashenko joining the club with the inhuman use of human trafficking to put pressure on Europe's borders. That's why our next step should be a full-fledged alliance of democracies that can push back on authoritarianism, set freedom-based technology standards, and stand up for democracy champions at home and abroad. Also, to reverse the democratic backsliding we have seen for a longer period. That's why today we are issuing this joint report on an alliance of democracies from concept to reality in an era of strategic competition, co-authored by Johannes Parello-Plesner, our executive director, with Ash Jain and Matt Koenig from Atlantic Council. The report explains how the leaders of the free world should act to bring the Alliance of Democracy into reality. I look forward to the discussion shortly. I'm pleased to see that we are joined by lawmakers and parliamentarians for this debate today too. Your voices are important. Perhaps a special welcome to Johannes Fogel, the deputy chair of FDP in Germany. We are pleased to see your party take a role in the new government. I'm personally encouraged by the different tone set by the incoming government, both on mentioning the need for an alliance of democracies and on the clear policy line on China and Russia. And with that, I will pass the floor and the virtual word to Damon Wilson, the president of the National Endowment for Democracy. Damon.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General. It is such a pleasure to see you on the screen and to be with you. You have been a tireless champion of freedom As Secretary General, I think you drove home the message that NATO was an alliance of free nations, and now you are so committed to turning that cause into reality. There's no better time for this report to come out for this conversation than this week, when President Biden is convening the Summit for Democracy here in just a couple of days, of course. And it's about how we rally free nations in common cause. And there's no better occasion than to have a serious consideration of Alliance of Democracies. And so I applaud this report. I applaud the council, its work for doing this, Secretary General Rasmussen for championing the cause, and the authors for actually taking this beyond just an idea, a concept, and playing out what would this look like? How would you do this? What would its focus be? Because it's complex. As any organizer of the summit this week knows, the mere invitation process a bit of a nightmare. And so you've taken the next step of helping to take an idea into action with laying out this report. So whether formal or informal, it's pretty clear democracies, allied democracies, need to be working together to shape a more just and democratic future. The nature of the challenge to democracy and freedom do make it the defining challenge of our time. We're managing populism at home, autocracy on offense, and people asking about the questionless of effectiveness of democracy. I think most in our audience recognize that we are in the 15th year of a democratic recession, but it's really been more about a more recent authoritarian resurgence fueled by an aggressive Russia and China in particular, using what we call sharp power, the learning that we see taking place among autocrats. And so the premise of my approach from my time at the Atlantic Council to now at the Endowment is that we do need a global coalition for democracy working in common cause, and the Alliance of Democracies is the most concrete expression of that. And I think we do need to recognize that right now today, the transatlantic relationship, the NATO allies, along with our Asian allies, really represent the spine of action for democratic powers. But I think the thinking behind all this, and I would argue it's broader than the mechanics of an alliance. As you at the Council of the Scopecraft Center have been talking about, we have to think of democracy as strategy. I've long thought that democracy is our most effective national security strategy because all of the things we spend money against and plan against are mitigated with the advance of democracy around the world. It is the most cost-effective approach to ensure the national security of the free world. But it's got to be premised as a strategy first on democratic unity, how we respond to defend each other. Secretary General has spoken articulately about this. When the Lithuanian border is challenged or Australia is intimidated, that we don't just have to observe, that we have a strategy that delivers policies that back up our allies immediately. But it also means a longer term commitment, particularly on the United States part, that we work to forge common strategies together with our democratic allies so that they are more comprehensive, more sustainable, and more effective. And this means from technology to kleptocracy. I think it also means, particularly today, that where we're being tested, we have to stand in solidarity with those on the front lines of this fight. Right now, we see that in Taiwan, we see that in Ukraine. That is where freedom is being tested. But it also is being tested in the closing of civic space and the challenges to civil society around our world. And making sure that the democracies feel a right to assist civil society around the world has to be part of this equation. We've got to be learning from each other ourselves so that we can raise our game, not just play defense. So I welcome this report as a way to help us think intentionally about how we can have an offense in favor of freedom. We need to show democracy can deliver, stand by those in the fight, stand up to those who are challenging civil society and Democrats, protecting the international organizations they're trying to capture, the norms they're trying to distort, the civic actors they're trying to repress. And as we push back on this, I think we need to underscore the fragility of the autocrats themselves and recognize the resilience of our own society. And so that's what's happening this week. President Biden has helped define the inflection point between democracy and autocracy, a theme, the drumbeat that began at the Atlantic Council. And the summit we can see in that context. And so as we consider next steps in a year of action, I welcome a very concrete proposal for an Alliance of Democracies as being part of that mix, because it's a new moment and it does demand new ideas, a new architecture. We've seen this protracted period of a building global crisis of democracy. We've seen authoritarian regimes have modernized their repression. They've not only tightened their grip domestically, they have adapted their techniques for this new era, deploying them abroad to exert international influence. And in this globalized environment, through the application of emerging technology, autocrats are bringing repression to scale. So one of the things that I think is quite powerful is that this report does sharpen the clear challenges for an alliance of democracy to these three big causes, which resonate with how I'm thinking about at the endowment strategy, our own work being defined by the systemic competition with autocracy first, by the challenge of democratic backsliding among our own, and third, with really the game-changing nature of emergent technologies and whether they will tip the balance in favor of freedom or the inverse. And so we're in a profoundly changed landscape. At the same time, we don't need to be in despair. This report, I think, captures brilliantly the extraordinary strength of the free world, economically, diplomatically, militarily, something we often underestimate. Doesn't mean we don't have work to do to get our act in order, of course, but it does mean that we need to have a bit of confidence in tapping that strength and understanding, furthermore, that the demand for democracy is quite resilient. After all, we won an existential argument. You watch Russia, Nicaragua, go through great lengths to undertake sham elections. The dictators themselves kind of accept some degree of legitimacy is based in our people, and they're sensitive to public opinion. And despite horrific challenges around the world, we see from Sudan to Burma to Ukraine, the continuing demand for freedom and democracy. People are in a demanding mood. And I think we need to understand that technology actually empowers much of this. And at the same time, we're in this battle and this structure in a way where there is an international democratic architecture today in which intergovernmental organizations are organized around democratic principles, governments dedicate resources, ties between political parties, parliament, civil societies. An alliance of democracies today needs to recognize this as a group of actors even beyond governments. So for us to adapt to this new situation, realizing that it's kind of different today than at the outset of the period of democratic decline because of the transnational nature of corruption, disinformation, technology, proliferation of anti-democratic narratives. These know no boundaries. So that requires, it almost demands solidarity-based responses among like-minded partners, which can be epitomized in the idea of an alliance for democracy. It does have to start with US leadership and this commitment and delivery on renewal at home. It has to be premised on democratic unity as an actual policy where we respond to defend each other, we forge strategies together, built around supporting democratic transitions and fragile democracies, defending democratic values against illiberalism and intolerance, and a real intentionality around countering malign authoritarian influence, particularly competing with authoritarians in the arena of tech and disinformation. And also support for those who are working to liberalize the authoritarian regimes and recognizing the agency at the end of the day that civil society is going to lead this effort in many places around the world. So I just want to close by saying I recognize and agree with the authors. The defining approach and challenge we have, systemic competition with autocracy, democratic backsliding, emerging technologies. But in the face of this, we've got to regain a little bit of our own momentum. We've got to understand that we are working in common cause. And we need to imagine what's possible. Any good strategy begins with setting out a clear goal. I think we need to understand that we have an ambition to work together to support those on the front lines who can help end this current democratic recession and support those who are going to make a fourth democratic wave possible. We need an offense in favor of freedom. And so that's why I see a real benefit in the president gathering leaders in a summit this week, defining this as the cause of our time and embedding the idea of an alliance of democracies as a concrete next step on the way forward. So with that, I'll throw it back to the studio and over to you, Ryan.
Thanks, Damon. We're now turning to the panel discussion where we'll look at how to make operational an alliance of democracies and what traps might exist along that journey. But before we go into that discussion, I want you to hear from two lawmakers. First, Johannes Fogel, who is the deputy chairman of the Free Democratic Party in the German Bundestag, joining the government tomorrow in Germany. And after that, Tom Tugendhat. He's a conservative MP, a freedom fighter who is the chair of the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. We'll hear from them now.
Hey, greetings from Berlin. My name is Johannes Fogel. I'm the vice chairman of the Free Democratic Party. We're going to elect the new German government tomorrow, and we're going to elect the new leadership of our parliamentary group today. And I'm running for chief whip of the Free Democrats. So that's why I'm unable to join you live, but I'm happy to provide some thoughts. And I think it's a very great idea that you're running a conference on an Alliance for Democracies. I do think it is not only feasible, it is absolutely necessary to go in this direction. 2 years ago, I think, I first elaborated in an op-ed the idea that we need some kind of organization of like-minded countries. Our world, our times is defined through a new systemic competition with with China under the Communist Party, and especially under Xi Jinping. And like Graham Allison from Harvard put it, the strategic thinking pause has only just begun. And I think that strategy equals structure. And we need some kind of forum. I think more than just a summit. I think we need some kind of permanent structure where like-minded countries like Portugal, Estonia, Malaysia, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Canada, the US, other European nations come together and build some kind of framework to bring on a strategic debate, how to deal with China, how to cope in this new strategic competition, because it will define our world. And I think it's great that the new US administration under Joe Biden is bringing forward the idea to hold a summit, but I think we need more. There is not a single global organization where these like-minded countries come together and debate about policies, about strategy on a regular basis. There's only the OECD, and the OECD is not doing anything regarding foreign policy and security questions. And that's why I think it's not only feasible, it is necessary. So thanks for bringing on the debate. I'm happy to join the next forum you do, virtual, to do it digital, but I also would love to debate with you, all of you, in a time, in face-to-face, in a time when Corona and the COVID crisis makes this possible. So I'm happy to see and hear what you're going to debate, and see you soon.
Today's challenges all require cooperation. How we work with our friends and allies is, of course, an essential building block to that cooperation, but it's not alone. We need to work with many others around the world. That's why we need to build alliances even with countries that aren't democratic. So why this Alliance of Democracies? Well, because actually, before you start working with others, you need to make sure you've got yourself aligned. If we look today at the challenge between autocracy and democracy, if we look at the way that different countries are trying to shape the international community, we can see that that challenge has never been greater. The reality is that during the Soviet period, those autocracies never had the financial muscle that the autocracies today can muster. So we need to think really hard about how we make sure we shape the world, how we shape the future in a way that is cooperative for everyone. And that means building on the liberties that we guarantee in democracies. Now, there are some democracies who are already part of the club. The G7, for example, is a great place to begin. But it's not enough. When we look at who was assembled in Carbis Bay, it included not just those 7, but also South Africa and South Korea, Australia, and of course, India. And between them, they made up some 70% of the global economy. Now, that demonstrates what a powerful building block we're starting from, but it can't be the end one. We need to make sure we include countries like Lithuania, like Luxembourg, but also countries that are trying out on that beginning path of democratic transformation, countries that are really struggling at the start of their journey, but we know we can bring in to a club of important nations that believe in the rule of law and of cooperation. Now, I also hope that we'll bring in states and jurisdictions that otherwise would be left out, places like Taiwan, that really do need support against autocratic power now more than ever. That's what I think this Club of Democracies is about. It's about making sure we shape the future in the interests of free people and the rule of law everywhere.
It's now time to introduce our panelists, and if you're just joining, I'm Brian Heath. I write Politico's Global Insider newsletter, now also a weekly podcast. So welcome to the discussion. Ash Jain, you're director at the Scopecraft Center here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for joining. Emma, you're a senior fellow also at the Scopecraft Center. And Johannes, who will be appearing on our screen, Johannes Parello-Plesner, who is executive director at the Alliance for Democracy out in Copenhagen. Ash, can I turn to you first? Tell me what you think has changed about the strategic landscape that demands new institutions, whether formal or informal. Is it that the other institutions simply were military focused? Is it that they were built in a different era when we didn't have this type of competition? What is it that means we need a new structure now?
Well, thanks, Ryan. It's great to join you today. Well, we've heard, I think, Damon Wilson really laid out the rationale for why we need an alliance of democracies today. The landscape has changed. We're dealing with strategic competition from autocratic powers, China and Russia, which have really advanced in much more assertive ways the way in which they're challenging the democratic world and the values and the rules-based system that the US and its allies have built over the past 7 decades. On top of that, we're dealing with an era where technology has emerged, disruptive and emerging, that can serve these autocrats and authoritarians and allow them to enhance their challenges against the values that we all believe in. So I think the world has changed. This is a time when democracies need to find new ways to collaborate, not just on military and security matters as NATO does in Europe, but on political and other challenges that require coordination across multiple domains. And that's really the rationale for an alliance of democracies. What's really exciting, I think, is not just that we see it's evident that there is a need, but the fact that so many around the world, leaders like who we just heard from in the UK, in Germany, across the Asia Pacific, have been calling for some kind of formalization of a network of democracies, whether it's through a structure like an alliance or a more informal channel like a D10. The Summit for Democracy that President Biden will organize this week is a really great starting point, because he has recognized this notion that the democratic world needs to come together and needs to begin this conversation around what actions can be taken to succeed in this era of strategic competition between democracy and autocracy. So I think it's now on us, and the report that we've put out today lays out some options on how to go from a concept and build on the rationale for what an alliance is, and then to take it from there and to build a structure and some ideas around how to make it real. And last, I'd say that the alliance itself, I think, is compelling because of the areas in which it could engage. There are the autocrats, China, Russia, others are putting coercive pressure, especially on smaller democracies around the world, and they're coping with those pressures by themselves. And what this alliance would do is create a network of support and provide sometimes resources, assistance, diplomatic support, other ways of backing up and showing the autocrats that they're going to face pressure and pushback when they try to engage in this kind of behavior. And then with regard to democratic backsliding at home, Damon, I think, laid out the challenges many of our own democracies face today. The report also suggests that the purpose of an alliance would be not just to focus on those authoritarian challenges, but to try to hold ourselves accountable to best practices and to ensure that we are also living up to the standards that we've set for ourselves. And we all know well that many of our democracies, the United States included, is facing some serious challenges. So I think that's the rationale, and I look forward to the discussion on where this goes. Thanks.
Thank you. I especially take on board the point about needing some kind of organization that deals in multiple domains. But Emma, I wonder, is there a reality check here that interested governments and parties need to put themselves through? You know, in the sense that if we could really make democracy better with just having an alliance, wouldn't we have done it already?
Well, thanks so much for having me, and congrats to Ash and the team, because I think this is a really great report, and I think, you know, I've seen this project progress from the very early stage, very broad outlines to, you know, they're really making this concrete, putting flesh on the bones, and thinking through what's actually possible in some ways. You know, I think there is a cynical way that you could look at an alliance of democracies or at the summit for democracies that the administration is doing. And that is that it's easier to go abroad than it is to actually just fix our problems here at home. But I think there's another way that you can look at it, and that is that it is easier to face problems together, and that democracies today have common problems. And I think that is the spirit in which this paper is offered. And I think that whether you are a realist, a liberal internationalist, everybody's starting to do more thinking about how foreign policy fits into our democracy at home, defending our values, and that kind of thing. So with that said, though, I mean, I do have some concerns about the notion of an alliance of democracies. You know, I wonder whether it is a good idea to make democracy or liberal values the linchpin of our approach to strategic competition, right? Because we could just focus on this as a power competition, as, you know, China's getting more powerful, Russia's being problematic, without necessarily making it a democracy versus autocracy competition. And I think there's some historical evidence to suggest that kind of competition may be more dangerous and more threatening to those states. So, you know, I would insert a word of caution here, as well as you say, a little bit of a reality check about what is possible. Again, something I think the paper does pretty well is lay out a suite of options, right? There's the Alliance of Democracies at one end, and then there's informal cooperation in existing institutions at the other. And so I think that's a good way of thinking through the actual realities of how hard this would be to do in practice. But, you know, let me, I guess, just put in a plug right at the end. My colleagues in NAEI, Matt Burrows and Evan Cooper, have a paper coming out next week that looks at similar issues, but from much more of a sort of a realist perspective. How should realists think about, you know, democracy promotion and the defense of democracy? You know, and some of the ideas that they propose, you know, humility in how we approach these issues abroad, thinking about triaging where we might actually be able to have some influence over backsliding democracies that are our allies or our partners. You know, these are ideas that I also see in many ways reflected in this paper, and I think that is a cause for hope. So again, congrats to Ash and the team on the paper.
Great. Johannes, I'll bring you in. I don't mean to lean too heavily on your European experience, but I did want to ask you what level of responsibility and burden European allies would need to take on in this alliance, this organization. You know, we see at other forums like OECD or the G20, where Europeans make up sometimes half or more of the membership, but don't necessarily do half or more of the leadership. We see disputes between the UK and the EU still that seem rather petty compared to these big systemic competition issues. So what do the Europeans need to do to work closely together and then show leadership within this organization?
Thank you, Ryan, and great to be here. I mean, first of all, I think the US is essential in this. So, I mean, that's also President Biden, who's hosting the Summit for Democracy this week. So definitely, I mean, without the US, but Europeans will form an equally important part of this. And I think it's quite encouraging to see a lot of European politicians speaking about this. We've just heard Fogel, Johannes Fogel from Germany, who will be part of the sort of the new German government, who's actually sort of been asking and said it was absolutely necessary to have a sort of more formal alliance of democracies, and we hear the same kind of elsewhere. And we've seen the The British, as still Europeans, not members of the EU, also during their G7 presidency, trying to sort of expand that to have other democratic nations, as Tugendhat also mentioned. So definitely, I think Europe will play a sort of important part in that. If we take the lighter version of the scenarios we built in the report, where it's built on existing structures, then something at the EU-US Trade and Technology Council that's just been established will be a really important part of setting norms and standards in the free world. That should, of course, be expanded with other democratic countries as well. But that could be one building block for sort of this alliance of democracies on the tech area. You see the European Union actually just this week coming out with the proposal for an anti-coercion instrument, which can be used for countries to sort of defend themselves against authoritarian economic coercion. That's something that we here in the Alliance have really been trying to address. For Rasmussen, the former NATO Secretary General, who was on earlier, and I've been building on an idea of an economic Article 5 that could have a sort of similar anti-coercion element to it, a way of having democracies agree to that and then sort of stand up for each other. And you do both retaliatory actions and also do sort of preferential treatment, so you could rebuild supply lines and supply chains after sort of coming under authoritarian coercion, as we see it currently with Lithuania and their the way that China is trying to kind of remove them from the trade map. So in that sense, I see European as being really vital in this. You mentioned, won't Europeans disagree when they get in the room? Yes, that's the nature of that's what they do as well when they're in the EU. So that, of course, wouldn't change necessarily, even if you brought it up to a bigger picture and said this is an alliance of democracies. But what we hope and really advocate is look at the big picture. I mean, what we are in is sort of systemic competition. We are particularly in emerging technology. We want to set the standard, so it's based on freedom, on our values. China has a different version. That's like digital authoritarianism. So we shouldn't sort of fall prey to just sitting and bickering among each other, but look at that bigger play at hand.
Thank you, Johannes. Now, a question to each of you. It's around membership. I know some people get frustrated with journalists sometimes. You know, with Biden's summit, it's people focusing on who's invited and who's not. But in your paper, you say it directly. Membership can be really a key determinant of the outcomes. And I think we established in the paper the G7 is too small, NATO is too focused on military. China and Russia have played a wrecker obstructionist role increasingly at the Security Council. So you have to go for something in the middle. You've sort of said 30 to 40 countries in the paper. I want to dig into what that means. Are we really talking the OECD or the OECD plus Brazil and India, for example? Tell us who you think it means. And I'll turn to Ash and Johannes, seeing as your names are on the paper, and Emma, you can come in last.
Sure. Well, it's a great question. And as you said, what we say in the paper is that membership is really critical to driving outcomes, because if you start with the wrong membership, it's going to be difficult to get really meaningful results from an alliance like this. So the way we're thinking about it is structuring criteria for who should be participating in such an alliance. Number one, it should be genuine democracies. Countries, governments that are committed to democratic values. Doesn't mean they're perfect. It doesn't mean they don't have issues to contend with. But it does mean that as a structurally, they're committed to promoting and defending democratic norms and values. Number two, it means nations and governments that are like-minded in the way they think about the challenges to the democratic world. The systemic competition with China and Russia, this era that we're in. It's important that those who join the alliance share a kind of common sense of purpose around those issues, including the others we've mentioned, and then a willingness to act, that if you're going to join an alliance, you're joining because you feel there's an imperative to take some action and to deal with these challenges. If you build some criteria around that, I think what the results will end up around 30 to 40 countries, maybe more, and I think there shouldn't be a cap. Certainly any countries, any number of governments that meet that should be in. But it is important to start with a kind of committed core, and that would include the US, probably most of its NATO allies, allies in the Asia-Pacific arena. Others, hopefully countries like India, in the developing world who are also on board with. Maybe harder at first for many of them because of their kind of foreign policy traditions to jump on board with this, but the door would be open. So I think we start with a core group, we build on that, we demonstrate that there's impact and a rationale behind this alliance, and then keep expanding as others wish to join in that common cause.
Mm-hmm. Johannes, anything to add to that?
Yeah, maybe two things. I mean, Ash laid it out greatly, and we've of course written the report together. I think topic is also one that would be defining. So depending on what topic you're talking about, is this semiconductors and other food? Then you of course need Taiwan, you need the Netherlands. So it's whatever topic you treat, of course, can also a little bit shape who is the members among democracies. But that underlines the action aspect that Ash also mentioned. And then second, we had an idea of renewable membership, of saying this is for 2 years. You join to take some action together with other democracies. So then you actually potentially also avoid a little bit of the whole backsliding issue questions inside institutions such as the EU and NATO. When first you're in, it's well, you can never be out almost again. And of saying this is something that countries commit to for a certain amount of period and a certain amount of actions, and then you kind of have to renew your membership. So that was one of the things I also wanted to add a little bit on the structure, and that means again it could be a different number of countries at a different period.
And Emma, I'll spice it up for you. Membership plus timeline. If you were running the show, would you be pressing go February 2022 or something like that? Or would you wait for follow-up from the Biden summit and maybe get more organized and do this in 2023?
You know, I continue to think that a formalized alliance of democracy is not in the near term. If it happens at all, it is not in the near term. I think the kinds of gradual forms of cooperation on specific issues, I think that's what we're much more likely to see over the next couple of years. And I guess on the membership question, let me just add a few few caveats. One is that I appreciate the work that they've done in this paper in thinking through some of the problems inherent in membership, particularly the permanent membership problem. But I do think there's somewhat of a tension here between the ability of this group, whatever it is, to be very selective about its membership and at the same time have influence on potential backsliding democracies, right? So if you let in the backsliders, you're being less selective on membership. If you don't let them in, you have less leverage. So I do think that is a circle that needs to be squared in some way. And I also think a little more thinking probably needs to go into the question of edge cases. That is to say, countries like Hungary or like Turkey that are in NATO maybe aren't in this grouping. And in some ways that might actually make it more difficult to formulate policy because you have different groups pointing in different directions. So again, I think the more gradual forms of cooperation tend to avoid some of those pitfalls.
Now, we have a great audience question, so I'm going to bring that in. It's from Jonathan Stone Street. I'll have to summarize it. It is a quite long question. But I think what Jonathan is getting at is to say that the benefits of democracy are often long-term. Costs and sort of getting to those benefits can have political prices. So what sweeteners can exist in that process for people being enticed into an alliance of democracies? Can, for example, richer countries think about debt relief or other instruments that make it easier, better, and having a short-term payoff as you go through painful democratic reforms and structural change? I throw it back to you, Ash, on that question. Oh, Johannes, you jump in.
Well, no, I definitely, and I think that should be part of it, both in general and also kind of specifically on the question of authoritarian coercion. After the alliance, they're offering countries something else. So when Lithuania right now is going through, of course, economic readjustment because trade with China and in certain goods have completely disappeared. We've seen, for example, the US step in with the US Exim Bank with a new type of loans that previously came from China. I also think we need to sort of free trade agreements among us. Free trade agreements are maybe not sort of the best word in many political circles, including in the US and parts of Europe. But then you could talk about a sort of democratic economic alliance, about sort of with some of the same content, that it would also give members that joined being part of this sort of club where you actually have the possibility also of democratic supply chains. So I think all of these that's in the question are quite important part of it, that because if the authoritarians, in particular China, has anything going for them at the moment, it's often that they say, sort of, we can show you the economy delivers, and that's sort of kind of the most important. So of course, that's also been a hallmark of democracy, of being able to deliver for people. So I think definitely that should be a strong component.
Could I jump in on that too? I think it's a great question. What is it about the alliance that would entice or be interesting to countries on the fence or who aren't certain whether an alliance like this should be part of their structure? Well, I think there are many reasons why an alliance like this would benefit countries, smaller, mid-sized democracies. One of which Johannes mentioned, the trade and economic benefits that could come from trying to move supply chains away, especially in critical industries, from autocratic countries, would benefit those that are part of a network like this. Technology and other areas. And then just with regard to influencing decisions and policymakers that are making decisions on a wide range of issues, if those decisions are made or at least consulted through an alliance like this, now you have a platform where many other smaller countries can contribute to those decisions and influence the outcomes.
You know, I'm not sure that I can really add much here, other than to sort of maybe express my concern that one problem here is that we're talking about sweeteners as if this is going to encourage lots of other countries to sort of suddenly adopt democracy. And I'm a little worried that formalizing an alliance of democracies might in some cases have the opposite effect. That is, if we talk about building better trade networks or, you know, other connections between those inside the group, it may actually incentivize the countries outside the group to look elsewhere. And so I think that's something that you know, leaders are going to have to look at very carefully as they think through how something like this would be structured. How do you avoid driving countries away by offering benefits only to those in the group?
Mm-hmm. Now, if this were to be succeeding over the long term, it's likely this alliance would have a mix of what I might describe as negative and positive incentives. It might be a mix of coordinated responses, but also, as Damon was saying, democracy as strategy, where you plan things out and you take the initiative as democracies. I wanted to get a sense of, do you think it matters what comes first in that process and what the balance is? You know, how much weight should be on sanctions when there's economic bullying versus let's coordinate on our research and development or set the standards for 6G before it becomes the dominant technology? Thoughts and reflections? You can go first, Johannes.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, I would actually prioritize the proactive, forward-looking agenda of saying, I mean, this is an opportunity to set standards together. This is an opportunity to do things together as democracies. I mean, why do we need a special forum? Because we know there are certain parts where we would not be able to do this in the UN. If we discuss the global internet in the UN, we have China and Russia and other countries that have a completely different version of a sort of sealed off, censored internet as being the future. So that's why sort of developing that among sort of democracies, you don't want to make the standard for that for foreign interference with Russia in the room, nor do you want to make the standard for like anti-coercion interference with China in the room in the UN. So I think tackling, you know, some of those quite proactively and saying this is an agenda where we want to make sure that we are on the front foot, and we want to make sure that these are standards that are based on freedom, on fundamental values, and making them come through. In that sense, yes, there is an element of systemic competition in this as well, but there's also just an element of like the free world setting its own standards.
Yeah, let me jump in, and then I'll let Ash have the last word on this. I actually think that is the right approach. You know, I think the pitfalls associated with this idea are mostly where it starts to turn outward facing, where it starts to talk about strategic competition with China and Russia, where it starts to push back against autocracies. Actually using some grouping like this to set standards, to strengthen our democracies at home, to work on things like fighting corruption or kleptocracy, you know, improving ourselves, you know, has the benefit both of making the Western democratic model more more attractive to other states while not raising some of those concerns in autocratic states. And so that is where I would start, with the understanding that down the road, you might expand it to other areas.
Yeah, no, nothing much to add. I think I agree with Jonas. I think setting standards, having a positive agenda is really the essence of an alliance. But it's not one or the other. Simultaneously, the challenges that are posed by autocratic powers need to be addressed, and a group like this could take strong action and facilitate coordination, even while it develops a more kind of positive standard-setting agenda.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the best parts of the paper is it runs through a series of scenarios or critiques of situations and posits how an alliance could react or be successful in these given scenarios. And I wanted to sort of recast one of them live for everyone who hasn't read the paper, and that's about democratic backsliding in Brazil, and hear from the authors why they think this outcome is possible, and then hear from Emma whether she finds it believable or not. And so in summary, what it is President Bolsonaro is refusing to accept the results of the 2022 presidential election. He thinks there needs to be a redo under his command and his election commissioners. But 39 out of the 40 members of the alliance on the day of the election have told him to step down and respect the results. And he worries that he'll be an international pariah, so he eventually accepts what the alliance has said and he leaves peacefully. My question is that a little too optimistic? And what else on top of a resolution from the alliance would be needed to get a President Bolsonaro to respect these standards of the alliance? I'll turn to the authors of the report first.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in on that. What we were trying to do in these scenarios is really depict and illustrate in a concrete way how could an alliance like this play a useful role. Obviously, in the words that we had on paper to do this, we had to kind of shorten and simplify what this could look like. That said, I think there is something to the notion that if a country like Brazil or others, where a leader comes to power and decides that doesn't want to respect the outcome of a democratic election, an alliance of democratic members could try to hold them accountable to those democratic norms. So one could imagine a group like this coming together to discuss the situation, especially if there's at the behest of actors in that country. It's not to substitute for the domestic institutions, many of which are equipped to deal with challenges like this, and that should certainly play out. The alliance shouldn't interfere with that. But if those are exhausted and there is no other recourse, I think an alliance could help by putting pressure on leaders who are backsliding, who are taking steps in the opposite direction and undercutting democratic values. And they do that by speaking out, number one. They do that by putting pressure on these leaders to abide by the norms, and they do that by potentially threatening to issue sanctions or asset freezes and travel bans and other kind of actions that are aimed at pressuring the governments to abide by these norms. That's where I think an alliance could be helpful.
Yeah, Johannes, if you could pick up on that. My personal tendency was to think there'd have to be an implicit or an explicit threat of travel bans, sanctions, asset freezes for this idea to work.
Oh, definitely, and I think Ash laid it out quite well already. And these are hypothetical examples. We actually add 3 of them scenarios in the report: one on backsliding, one on sort of the race for technology, and one on sort of authoritarian coercion, and with different kind of examples to make it practical of how you could go about this. I mean, I could only add maybe that that's also where the renewable element in membership could come in. The fact that you're not there forever, meaning that if you change, backslide, or anything and don't do the same things for democracy, you're not necessarily a member down the road as well. That, of course, could also be a sort of powerful incentive for other countries inside your own country to sort of push for a leader not kind of taking those steps. I mean, in the case here with Bolsonaro, I mean, he of course also has a whole, in this imagined example, a whole democratic system to play up against that would, of course, also, if there's an international response, see that as their call to action inside the country.
Yeah, let me a little, I guess, let me offer a slight alternative here. So, because I think a lot of the ideas that are being suggested here are sticks, right? Sanctions, travel bans, asset freezes. These are the things that we do already. We may not do them through an alliance of democracies, but we do them through the US, we do them through the EU, and they are effective sometimes and often not effective. And so, I think that to the extent that this grouping is valuable, it would be in providing carrots that might be better at encouraging leaders like Bolsonaro in this scenario to want to stay in the group. So if being in the group brings free trade benefits, if being in the group brings an open visa arrangement with the United States, those are massive benefits that are much harder for leaders to say, I'm just going to back away from that. And so I think, focusing on the carrots rather than on the sticks might be one way that this group could actually get some leverage over those sort of edge cases.
Let me just say, I completely agree with Emma. I think the powerful incentives that a group like this could provide could be just as meaningful and complementary to anything it can do on the coercive side.
Absolutely. And as I was hearing you speak, Emma, it was reminding me of the back and forth the EU's had with Hungary for so many years, and the European People's Party that Orban's Fidesz party was a member of. And it was a dance back and forth between these carrots and these sticks. And people are slowly getting to an answer. I want to thank all of our panelists, Johannes, Emma, Ash. That was a great discussion. I wish you the best of luck in driving the report forward and engaging with Biden Summit and other actors over the coming days, weeks, and months. Thank you very much. It's now time to turn to Ambassador Daniel Fried, who's going to wrap up today's event. Over to you, Ambassador.
This was a great discussion. I've listened to a lot of panels. This one was value added rather than wasted time. So terrific. The context is really interesting. While we're having this discussion, President Biden is preparing for what will be a difficult call with Vladimir Putin, who is using the threat of a major war in Europe to try to bully his neighbor, democratic Ukraine, and frighten Europe and the United States into concessions. Putin is an authoritarian. He believes in it. He puts his political opposition in prison or tries to murder them. China makes a virtue out of a whole bunch of adjectives in front of the word democracy, which means it isn't. That's the context. No wonder Ash, Jane, and Anders Fogg Rasmussen and the whole team wants to put together a mechanism to unite the democracies. The autocrats are working together. It's natural to think that the democracies should also. Now, this discussion has unpacked some of the problems, but it's done so in a way to try to find solutions. I really like the idea of using consultations among democracies to address issues of trade, technology, anti-corruption. That's a big deal. And I suspect that Biden's people who are trying to make the Summit for Democracy a real thing are going to seize on this. Look, Emma Ashford outlined a lot of both the problems and outlined some potential solutions. Emma Ashford is a rising star of the realist, the latest generation of the realist school, and to have her on board, at least thinking through the problems, suggests that there is a consensus to get something done. I don't know what the answer is. Build it from the ground up. Informal consultations. Nothing lasts like the provisional. That's one way to do it. Another way is top down. Take the Summit for Democracy and turn it into a structure. Lots of problems: membership, criteria, permanence, bureaucracy. I get it. But this is the right discussion to have. Damon Wilson framed it up wonderfully. And this discussion has carried forward the promise and the problems of this issue. So, terrific. I had nothing to do with the paper. I looked at it in draft, so this is not self-serving when I say that it's a real contribution, not because it has the answers, but because it plants the flag of an idea and actually tries to go beyond talking about it to grappling with the problems. So terrific. This week, we see an autocrat threatening war. We see a democratically minded leader, President Biden, attempting to rally democracies. And let's also face it, we Americans have our problems at home with authoritarianism as a political movement in this country. Modesty? Oh yeah, you bet. We're all in this together, we, the crooked timber of humanity. Thank you.